I think we should get started now. Once again, this is John Paralisi, the Spark Project Director. Welcome to meeting 2 of the Health and Education Advisory Panel. Thanks everyone for taking the time out of your schedules to attend the session. As I get started, before kind of going through this whole slide deck in order, I did want to kind of maybe jump to a couple slides to provide some framing about where we are that hopefully will maybe put people's a little bit more at ease after getting an incredibly long list of submissions and pre-reads. So the big net of this is the fact that for this session, no one is required to have completed or even started those pre-reads. If you look at kind of this filter slide, it kind of talks about where we are now. And we are, at the second session of 5, and we're right at the point where literally, a little over a day ago, we captured all of the submissions from a number of different sources. And so the goal of this session was to take the work that had been done in the last session around the focus areas and the additional areas that were added based on the input of the panelists. And we have been pulling together some of the research in those areas as well. To then begin to kind of place those submissions in that context. So to be able to kind of provide a view of what the lay of the land is. So once again, we're not expecting to make any decisions today. This is really just a chance to be able to get everyone here, the information as early as possible to begin to look at, so that when it comes to meetings 3, 4, and 5, and the panel is going to need to start making some decisions about where to prioritize, it will have had the information for a while. So for this session, what we've done is really try and kind of lay out where those submissions fell against the really, really broad health and education spectrum to begin to have some discussions around that. And we've kind of broken out the discussions in each one of those areas. On this second slide, 13, and I promise I will come back to all of these in the correct order eventually, but just to kind of jump to the punchline. There are a bunch of common themes that we saw around needs in every one of those focus areas, like behavioral health, disability services, senior services. And we got a good number of submissions in each one of those areas. And there's no doubt that every single one of these boxes represents a need and an opportunity, regardless of whether there are submissions in them or not. And at the end of the day, the challenge for this panel is going to be, given the fact that it's so broad and everyone probably comes in here with an area of focus that they're most comfortable with, there's going to be a balancing act of having provided their expertise and insights around the area they're most familiar with. At the end, is going to need to look at this, all with kind of their integrated hats on and think about where the greatest priorities might reside in order to put together the final set of recommendations that Senator Erickson and Robyn will be bringing up to the Spark Executive Committee. But that's part of the opportunity here, is to think about this in an integrated sense. the Spark Executive Committee, one of their big goals was to be able to look at all of this in an integrated manner, just in terms of being able to think about priority setting. I think it was President Masterson who put it a good way, saying, when I say yes to something, I want to know all the other worthy things I might be saying no to. And that is going to be particularly true within this panel, where there are an awful lot of needs, not all of which will be able to make it to the top of the priority set right now. And so, our goal as a support group is to try and help the panel provide information and provide ways of thinking that through. And then the Spark Executive Committee itself, has replicated this process, not just within health and education, but, asking panels in connectivity, as well as economic revitalization and efficiency and modernization, all to kind of come up with a set of priorities within those spaces and bring those to them so that they can make some integrated decisions. So once again, we don't expect everyone to have been able to go through all of or any of the information that's out there in terms of the submissions and any of the follow-on research from the last session. We just wanted to get in your hands early, so that as we continue through this process, you'll have had a chance to absorb it. But once again, for this session, what we've done is we're trying to kind of, we've gone through it and we're beginning to kind of portray it in some of the emerging themes that are coming from that. So hopefully that maybe puts people's minds a little at rest as we go into this process. So that being said, before I go into kind of starting to walk through this process, and one last thing is, I was the one piece of feedback that came out of the exit surveys for every panel that everyone agreed to was that I should probably talk less at the start of these. And so we have set up this document to really make sure we have a lot of time for discussions around some of the themes and the trends that we've seen out of the submissions and some of the additional analysis, to be able to engage in discussion across the panel as you guys begin to kind of wrap your heads around the entire opportunity. So with that being said, before I start walking through, Senator Erickson, do you have any kind of thoughts or comments?
Thank you so much, John. And I just want to thank you and your team for providing these resources and materials. I don't know about any other panel members, but to me, 250 submissions is a lot. So I look forward to going through in more detail on those. And I just appreciate everyone being having their time this morning to go through these and try to come up with some way to structure it. And look forward to the discussion. And with that, I will turn it back over.
Great, thank you. Robyn, are you on the? Okay. Robyn had mentioned that she might have actually had an unavoidable conflict on this, but we try and make it. But
John, I am on the call.
Oh, great.
I just couldn't get off mute. Yeah.
Oh, awesome.
I'm just excited for us to get started. I think you guys have put together a really good summary document for us to look at. And I appreciate the disclaimer that you've given that we don't have to make decisions quite yet.
yeah, that's right. So, great. Well, thank you. Appreciate that. So in terms of the agenda, real quick, once again, it was going to spend some time going through the purpose of the session, but then we're really going to be able to dive into discussions and brainstorming around some of the emerging themes from the ideas. Then in the third part, we're going to talk about, as a group, we need to think through how we want to handle filtering and topic prioritization. So we want to get guidance from the panel around how to think about, which filters should be really hard filters. Because if you remember that funnel, it showed, and we didn't even guess that we get over 200 ideas. So we should put 200 submissions that might become 100 after we filter. Don't know what's going to happen here, but we've already started taking a crack for each submission in terms of understanding the potential allowability. But whether there are some other factors that should, be major things to consider as we filter and prioritize prioritize. Would like to get some of your early thoughts on that. We can talk about that. And then talk about the next steps around, how we want to approach kind of focusing in and grouping some of the submissions into kind of programmatic ideas where it makes sense, and fleshing those out in conjunction with the panelists. So with that being said, go to the next slide. So, just to remind everyone where we are, we're in the second meeting of 5. And, so the next meeting will be in a few weeks. Right now, once again, mentioned it before, we are really in the initial idea brainstorm. We're looking at kind of what information we've gotten from the submissions, and also how they fit into the needs matrix that we had presented and then modified based on the input of the panel last time to add a few areas. And so, we're going to spend the bulk of our time having some discussions of what's come out of that thematically. Go to the next slide. So, the next slide is just meant to kind of give everyone a feel for, how to think about this process. So in the first session, we had identified some areas of focus. And then a couple others were added in around disability services, senior services to focus in on. As we could see coming out of even just the submissions, there were some common needs across, all of those areas in terms of basic needs, access and awareness, workforce development, availability, affordability, data, systems integration. Generally, those are some fairly common areas of need across all of those areas. So we've been kind of building our knowledge from the left-hand side over to the right. From the submissions, we've gotten anything ranging from ideas to specific project submissions. In a lot of cases, those will, there are some project submissions that are all very similar. They can be kind of bundled into programmatic areas. And that kind of is almost the default level for this set of funds even to play at. There may be some things that look more like a distinct project and we'll need to analyze it down at the project level. But really, what we're largely probably going to be thinking about here is more programmatic areas. So we will be looking at kind of acknowledging 250 different submissions, but a lot of them are going to be similar and are probably going to get bundled up into programmatic areas. Not that they'll get lost as individual submissions, because they still exist within those programmatic areas. And in the areas that get approved for focus by the panel and by the Spark Executive Committee, once an area is approved, those submissions will then be still within there in that area to be looked at through a procurement process. Once again, this particular set of funds had some special requirements around it with how that procurement happens. So that would happen outside of this particular panel. Go to the next slide. In terms of thinking about, guiding principles and allowability rules, things to keep in mind in terms of prioritization is that in addition to just the judgment of the panel itself, there are a couple other things in terms of where the greatest needs and opportunities are. There are two other things that the panel should be thinking about. One is always keeping top of mind the guiding principles from the Spark Executive Committee in terms of, how they're going to think about the priority setting across the ideas coming from and recommendations coming from the panels. And I'll talk through that again. I think that's a good reminder, because the Spark Executive Committee is going to be seeing recommendations from 4 panels. So trying to have those top of mind as the advisory panel is coming up with a set of recommendations can be pretty important, because that's going to be the lens through which the Spark Executive Committee looks at all the recommendations. And secondly is the allowability. We'll talk about that a little bit as well. in terms of the allowability, you should know that, we have expertise on the support team that already is beginning to look at each one of the submissions to understand the allowability, in terms of, it would always be allowable, never allowable, or even kind of potentially allowable depending upon how it's crafted, and where you need to be able to get more information around that. And so there are some general guidelines, but even there, we're going to be bringing expertise in to look specifically at each one of the areas to make a call on allowability. Go to the next slide. I just, had talked through this in the previous slide, but once again, there are some things that are always allowable, and there are some things that aren't allowable, and a lot of things conditionally allowable if they offer services or benefits for members of disproportionately impacted communities or sectors. So that includes populations in qualified census tracts, services addressing health disparities, communities disproportionately impacted by the pandemic. This plays out differently for this probably the bulk of the submissions coming into each one of the panels. A lot of the things coming out of this panel would probably be allowable, because a lot, the things that are always allowable are basically, responding to the public health emergency is number one. So keep that in mind. Allowability may not be as big an issue across all of these submissions, which is going to make prioritization, all the more important. Slide 6, though, talks about the guiding principles for the SPARC Executive Committee. And this is something that, we're going to really need to be able to think about, or the panel will. That top one, in terms of prioritizing sustainable programs and investments through one-time use of funds versus substantial expansion of existing services, that is very top of mind for the SPARC Executive Committee. And so as, we look through that, look through the submissions, look through kind of the potential sets of priorities that come out of this, that's going to be something that's really going to be top of mind, and in some ways almost probably a go, no go at the SPARC Executive Committee would be my guess, but ultimately it's going to be their decision. Thinking through the opportunity to leverage local and agency funds to maximize use of discretionary funds. So, as we start honing in on these areas, and we'd already started doing that, understanding where, not only where there could be opportunity to leverage, but understanding, there are needs all across that matrix that, I previewed earlier. Some of those areas have received more funding and are continuing to receive more funding than other areas. So we'll need to think about that as we go forward. Potentially thinking through the areas that may have received the least funding, but also have the greatest needs, are certainly areas to kind of really keep in mind. And then foster long-term systemic impact for Kansas is going to be really important. And then ensuring the appropriate amount of flexibility with the investment strategies, ensuring that, whatever comes out of this, we can measure results, transparency. Those are all going to be important considerations in terms of the guiding principles that the SPARC Executive Committee has already put a lot of thought into. Go to the next slide. Just to, and I'm going to stop. We're going to get into discussion very quickly, but just wanted to acknowledge a few areas, both based in on the panel's feedback of the previous session, as well as some of the requests in the exit surveys. The support team kind of pulled together some fact packs on, mainly around existing research. And I would say that KLRD did a yeoman's work in terms of pulling all this information together. It's a lot of information, so we should all thank them for that. But we did pull together information that was sent out to folks. Once again, don't expect you to have absorbed all of that at this point, but kind of wanted to get it into your hands as early as possible so you could start looking at it in the areas of senior services, disability services, and literacy. And and here just have some kind of a high level, top line things to, maybe note from that, needs in every single one of the areas, but also maybe a little bit more texture around each one of them, as well as, noting all of the information that exists in one of those areas. So in terms of that, I mean, I'm not going to kind of restate what's on the slide. You guys can obviously see that. And there's much more rich and deep information in the fact packs that were sent out. So once again, thanks to KLRD and the support team for pulling all of that together. Go to the next slide. So in terms of going into the brainstorming around some of the emerging themes, as Senator Erickson mentioned, the submission process closed a couple of days ago, and in total, there were 758 submissions received across the 4 panels. And the health and education panel, in terms of, and it was the submissions, the person who submitted it themselves who stated which panel it should go to, received, I believe, 251. So a really high proportion of the submissions came in targeted this area, which isn't a surprise given that the area is broad, and this is an area that's incredibly important to people, and is an area that has received a lot of impact over the last couple of years. And so, once again, don't expect people to have been able to go through all the detail themselves. We're still going through the detail on all this, but we did want to be able to start presenting to you kind of where the submissions fell out and have a discussion amongst this group around your thoughts around some of the things that had come out of that in terms of themes. So if you go to the next slide, if you look at kind of the 6 big focus areas, and once again, the number of submissions doesn't necessarily mean the importance of any one of these areas. But this is just to give a feel for, where the submissions, where they laid across all these 6 areas with, significant distribution across the areas, 50-50 split between health and education. Smallest number of submissions came in disability and senior services. That doesn't mean that those areas are less important. And submission ideas frequently signaled potential to benefit multiple focus areas. And we'll talk about that a little bit, in the fact that some of the themes were so common. There may be a question at one point for the panel to think about, is there a program or an approach that you could focus on that actually impacts multiple focus areas at the same time. But anyway, at a top line, here is how they distributed themselves. On slide 11, the next slide, thematically, the support team also looked at them, not just in terms of which of the focus areas like behavioral health or disability service they fell into, but also just started categorizing the types of needs in terms of baseline needs around basic needs and access and awareness, around capacity and capacity building, so workforce development, availability and affordability, and then around enablers like data and systems integration. So when you look at, you kind of put the submissions, you kind of flip them on their side, you can see them through a lens where you see a lot of kind of common thematic, common themes as a way of grouping them as well. And this could be important, not just for a way of being able to structure the information, but also, once again, there could be, as we step back and look at the submissions and what's coming out of them in more detail, not only just some common themes, but maybe even some common platforms for approaching issues and opportunities that could impact multiple areas of focus. So on the next slide, that's exactly what I had talked about in terms of thinking about where the intersection might be of the types of needs in each one of the focus areas. I've given you kind of the preview, which is the next slide. You can go to that right now, around kind of where those submissions played out there. So being able to think about ways of categorizing the information, and eventually being able to set priorities is going to be incredibly important. And to that end, as I mentioned before, I think it's going to be really important for not just the panel as a whole, but for all of the panelists over time to really try and think about this from an integrated standpoint, moving beyond just the area that you're the most comfortable with, because it may be that, the greatest priorities don't necessarily, at least for this particular set of funds, exist within that area. So that's going to be a challenge for everyone just because of the breadth of health and education in general. And once again, the other thing is that, given how many needs and opportunities there are going to be, thinking about, are there maybe some systemic opportunities that may be able to kill more birds than one with one stone. I guess, we're going to be able to dive, rather than kind of going into it at this point, let's continue and then we can dive into some of the discussions. So, the big discussion for today, and we really want this to be a discussion, is, begin thinking about kind of reacting to, where the information is coming out, as well as beginning to think about, where to potentially be able to focus the efforts. It may be really hard to do it. No one's absorbed all the submissions, but beginning that discussion now, I think, is just going to help set the panel up for success going forward. So reviewing some of the emerging themes, and I'm going to let people, so this is taking a focus area, behavioral health, and it's showing against kind of categories of needs. Here are some of the potential programmatic themes and even example submissions that could help give a little bit of flavor to what a program could look like there and the number of submissions. So, and once again, just because facility or program expansion has the most, 15 doesn't necessarily mean that at the end of the day, that's necessarily the most important strategic area for the long term, but it is an indication for sure. So what I'd suggest doing is let everyone maybe spend 3 or 4 minutes looking through this and thinking about it, and then let's open it up to discussion around thoughts about this, and where some of the opportunity points might be, whether we're missing anything in terms of this framework. And the goal would be to kind of begin engaging in some of this discussion, focus area by focus area, just to kind of get everyone's focus thinking about kind of the entire spectrum of opportunities here. So I will stop talking, which I'm sure everyone will be happy with. And so my computer shows 10:28, like at 10:32, after everyone's had a chance to kind of read through this, I'll open it up again for discussion. So I'll start the discussion again in a bit about a minute. One thing to note here too, though, is that if you look at it, it was an awful lot of submissions in the kind of capacity area. The one thing out of fairness, and I mentioned before, the number of submissions doesn't necessarily reflect, absolutely what the opportunity might be, but it may be a pretty good indication of where Kansas is thinking in terms of the people who submitted. The thing to note, though, is around things like basic needs, social determinants of health, community-based resources. You'd note that some of those don't have a number against them because they got counted in some other areas, because in some cases it was hard to make them, they were things that could impact behavioral health, but they weren't necessarily specifically aligned just towards behavioral health, at least in the submission itself. So there are some things that don't have numbers against them in terms of numbers of submissions. But that, once again, part of that is just some things tend to, were hard to kind of place in one portion of the matrix or another. So with that, I kind of open it up in terms of, some discussion around what do people think of the distribution, and also just generally, this is the first time you've seen kind of this way of breaking down, thinking about the needs. Is this a good way to do it? Or is it missing anything? Is there a different way of thinking about it?
John, this is Robyn. I'll kick it off. It doesn't surprise me at all that the two categories that have the biggest number of submissions, and again, I realize that submission doesn't necessarily mean that's the need, but it doesn't surprise me that the biggest areas are workforce. If you combine recruit and retain and pipeline, you got 18 submissions, and then capacity with really probably 20, 15 and 5, because I think anybody, at least for behavioral health, and I am guessing this is true for education as well, the biggest needs are people and space to provide the services in. So those two things didn't surprise me at all.
Thanks. Anyone else?
John, it's Renee. I do have a couple of questions. Do we have a total amount of the submission request? Do we have a bottom line for that?
In terms of dollars?
Yes, total dollar amount for the submissions.
Yeah, we haven't. I'd actually wondered about that yesterday. I don't know that we've added it up at this point, but that'll be a next step. We'll look at it. I mean, my guess is, just eyeballing it across all of the submissions, it's billions of dollars of submissions.
Okay, and then my second question, John, would be, is there any data around the geographic submissions? Do we have so many from cities or municipalities versus counties versus those that would have a statewide impact?
We asked the questions that would allow that to be sorted that way. So we can look at that. It was really more around because we asked each person who was submitting to say what areas geographically would it impact. So that's a great idea. So we'll do that for sure. Thank you.
This is Representative Christy Williams, and I'm with Renee in her office. So also, when we're looking at these, the overall impact, yes, the regionality, yes, but can we also see how many submissions in each area of the state? Because I do think that there'll be some accountability on that as well.
Okay, I think we'll have the information to do that. I'm not quite sure. Let me check on that. I mean, if we do, we'll definitely do it. It won't be hard if we got the fields to be able to do all of these cuts, and they would all be useful, I'm sure, for the panel. So happy.
And my last request is that once the categories get moved around and the list, I'm just here with Renee, and on my Macintosh, it's not pulling up the entire list. So maybe once it's set, it could be in a PDF as well. We wouldn't be able to link to the actual submission application, but at least we'd be able to see it if we couldn't get it to pull up on our laptop.
Yeah, we'll work on that. And once again, apologies. A lot of this was kind of like a lot of late breaking information, but we wanted to be able to give everyone kind of an early view of it too. But we'll make sure that, particularly since we have time now, to make sure that it's accessible for everyone in multiple ways. Any other thoughts around behavioral health in terms of surprises? Anything else, anything people think is missing here?
This is Sean. I think for the most part, I agree with Robyn that this really wasn't surprising that majority of the submissions were around workforce and availability, affordability. And to answer Senator Erickson's question, because I was curious about that as well, as the total amount of requests, it was 2.6 billion when you go totaled up.
Yeah, I did get a note from the team. The total is 2.6 billion, but there was one really large request in there that knocked it up to a higher level.
And then one or two additional thoughts. My guess is there's going to be a pretty broad cross-cutting theme with the recruit and retain incentives between the different focus priorities. So just my 2 cents, I think it'd be helpful if we somewhat tried to address those together and had a better understanding of what's been given, what hasn't, what other funding was available, what other states have done. So it's not a hodgepodge type of disorganized recommendations or approach around that particular theme. And then when I was looking at some of the just the initial skim of some of the proposals that were more construction or capacity building, to use dollars for those, whether it be a school or mental health hospital bed expansion, it'd be helpful to know through the filter and scoring system or in some manner, just while this is one-time funding, what is there long-term funding for those? Is it a reallocation of resources? Is it using existing funding? Just as somewhat popped in my mind as I was looking through the initial list.
Yeah, particularly given the focus of the Spark Executive Committee, I think, big focus on one-time use of funds. And even if it's something that looks like it may be a one-time use of funds, we're going to need to understand any type of kind of trailing costs that could be incurred with a largely one-time use of funds. So for sure. Good point.
This is Robyn again. I echo what Sean said in the beginning of his comments, that it would be nice to be able to look at what, both from a state perspective and a federal perspective, we've already spent on recruit and retain.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not going to say the need isn't still there, because it certainly is, but it would be good to look at how much we've already spent in that area.
Yeah, and this was into another point I think that you were making, Sean, correct me if I'm wrong, was that recruit and retain is maybe an area where, if you look at that need, the solution could, or the approach could go across multiple focus areas, right? Behavioral health and other areas. And so we've even toyed with, maybe rather than looking at this as the first cut by focus area like behavioral health, to really look at it more by those needs, like recruit and retain, right? And so we've, the sport team has cut the data both ways. And I think that and you'll see a later slide where it begins to kind of touch upon what you see when that happens. But I think the panel is going to need to think about it both ways, right? There are going to be some, I would suspect, some initiatives that got prioritized that are squarely within a focus area. And there may be some that are actually maybe more around a need and may cut across several focus areas. Yeah, I think that was what you're getting at, John, right?
Yes, it was. Thank you.
All right, well, let's move on to the next one and kind of just go through the same process. So early childhood development, once again, it's 10:42. I'll pipe up again around 10:45, 10:46, but you guys, kind of take a look at it and then we can kind of have a similar discussion again. One thing once again to note here is there are no submissions or no number for them next to social determinants of health, because the submissions are represented in the general health bucket. So all right, so I guess I just open it up again for some kind of integrated discussion around, anything here, not surprise people, anything missing, um, any other information that could be helpful around it. Any general observations?
This is Robyn again. I guess not working in education or especially early childhood education, it was a little bit surprising to me the number of submissions in the top two categories.
Mhm.
That really is which really speaks to the incredible level of economic need
Mhm.
in our state, which I guess was just the number of submissions was a little bit surprising to me in that area.
Sure. Anyone else? I mean, once again, this is an area where capacity, and this will be the case probably across almost all of them, particularly, but where capacity is an issue. And with some of the kind of pre-work that had been done, that had been an area that had been kind of highlighted from a data standpoint as well. Any other thoughts? Okay. Let's move on to the next one. So same drill, this is general health. And so let's go to 1050, take a look at it, and then we can kind of talk about people's observations after having, looked at where the submissions fell and also just kind of the nature of some of the submissions. Any initial observations or thoughts here? Once again, this is the beginning of the discussion on these things. And particularly one thing I note as we begin focusing in on the areas where eventually where the panel thinks that maybe the greatest need is or priority, once we start doing that, we can start looking at where there may be opportunities for transformative solutions, best practices, looking at either best practices that exist within Kansas or in other states. So we'll be able to kind of bring more focus and probably more creativity and examples to the table, hopefully, the more we hone in on particular areas. But that being said, initial reactions or observations?
John, I'm sorry I'm talking every single time. I hope some of my other committee colleagues will jump in and speak as well. But I really appreciate your comments about let's look at best practices across other states, because at least in my area of knowledge and expertise in behavioral health and health in general, there are some very good models that have been implemented in other states. Oklahoma, Texas, for sure, have some very good models. And I think that's a great idea to kind of line some of those up against some of the submissions to see how much we can replicate and not recreate the wheel.
Sure. Yep.
this is Mclean, and I don't know if you saw in the chat, I've got kids at home and a lot of noise, so I'm going to utilize the chat function to the extent that I can. And this is more of an overarching comment with regard to all of the categories, but if there's a way to layer in the recommendations that the Governor's Commission on Race Equity put together. They spent over a year doing a bunch of community convenings to determine those recommendations toward greater race equity, including, gosh, I can't quantify, but out of the 120 recommendations, about a third of them were health related. Others were education and workforce related, but through a race equity lens. And given the task force's guidance with regard to COVID recovery, specifically in health injustices, a layering of the two might help us to narrow down or at least better assess the submissions that we received.
Yep. I mean, we can certainly do that overlay for sure.
I appreciate that recommendation, Mclean. And Robyn, is there a way that you could get us information on what you were referencing for Texas and Oklahoma so that we could look at those?
Sure, I'd be glad to.
Like, sorry.
I can send that to John and team.
Thank you.
I think that's going to get maybe a little easier to digest, probably when we get to specific areas. I mean, if there's some general things for sure, right? And I'm sure there's going to be lots of information and examples to bring to bear. It may be a little hard to be able to do it against like a grid of like 60 items. We could share it, but it would probably be just a lot to absorb.
I just noticed as I was going through the submissions last night, I just noticed that there were several that were consistent with some things that Oklahoma City and Texas have both done in the area of homelessness, access to basic needs, access to health, and access to behavioral health.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, any examples that we can see where someone's been trying something maybe different on the ground and gotten some good results. Yeah, certainly. We'll work our best to bring all those to the table, and maybe even some experts in some of those areas where warranted. As we work through the process. One other question: no one's reacted to anything on the enabler side around data and systems integration, around either kind of some of the submissions that came in around ecosystem integration and just data and IT. I mean, how are people kind of thinking about that area?
I'll just say as someone who's not in the IT space, but is in health, I know that it's extremely important for that integration to occur, especially if we're talking about, sustainability measures and also opportunities for, cost savings and increased access, particularly, rural areas and whatnot, and just making the system work better together. And the number of submissions, I don't really have an opinion on that. Would just need to see what those submissions sort of say to get a better sense of how well they address or propose to address the issues.
Sure.
This is Senator Sykes, and I have not looked at the submissions because it wasn't able to access those, but I think we do have some systems in place in the state that maybe, looking at, and I can't remember if it's Daisy or Iris, but those are some issues that are trying to do that. So since I haven't looked at those specific requests, but I do think it is important. And I mean, it's a way to kind of not have those gaps in the circle, like whether it's getting mental health or there are some things that I think we can do.
Yeah.
I wasn't surprised to see the greatest number of submissions be in this health category, because we are I would say, pretty far behind many states in our transportability of medical records, even though we all have electronic systems. There's pretty poor transportability, very
Mhm.
siloed.
Got it.
John, it's Senator Erickson. As I'm looking at this, I have kind of a broader question. Can you speak a little bit to the duration of impact? I was curious as to, was that self-reported or did your team analyze that? Because that to me is a big deal, looking at the guiding principles from the Spark Committee.
It was self-reported, because keep in mind, we just closed the submission forms, a day and a half ago, but we included it as something where when they put together their description and case for their submissions, that they self-reported that. I think that as we then eventually go into within the priority areas, starting to then do some scoring and prioritization, the panel with the support team are going to need to then take a hard look at some of those things to say, okay, yeah, well, what do we feel based on the information that we have and our judgment? But we have the data to do kind of some preliminary looks at it based on self-reported information. Well, we'll move on to the next area. It sounds to me like also there's just an opportunity for a lot of overlays here in terms of, to Mclean's suggestion around thinking about it from an equity standpoint, looking at kind of, the proposed budgets, the funding to date, what's already been in play, being able to overlay, where best practices may exist within the state or from other states. There's a lot that we can begin to overlay on this. And we're going to need to for the panel itself to be able to set some priorities. So I'll let everyone on K-12 in higher ed kind of take till maybe 11:03 to look at this. One thing I'll say is, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong from the support team through the chat, is that there was one area of higher ed around kind of like innovation parks and the innovation ecosystem there that I'm not sure. I think we moved that to economic revitalization just because of its close link to business. But if I'm misrepresenting that, correct me if I'm wrong. It's an economic revitalization. So just in case anyone was expecting it here, it's over there.
John, this is Representative Williams. Can you refresh us with what the estimated total for our Sparks Committee for Health and Education, that total spend amount would be?
We haven't, the Spark Executive Committee hasn't set like ranges that it wants to see from each individual panel at this point. It may going forward. We're going to be setting up a meeting with the Spark Executive Committee in about a week and a half out. So there's that. In terms of the overall bucket is 731 million, so they could go up to that point. The other thing to keep in mind in some of these areas, there may be areas where there are other source of funds as well, or ability to be able to leverage local funds. But generally, I do know the Spark Executive Committee is expecting to get well more than $731 million of funding ideas, in aggregate across the panels, because that's the only way at the Spark committee level, they're going to be able to make those integrated trade-offs. So I guess the short answer is we don't have it yet. I guess diving into this one, once again, opening up any observations. You know, one observation, by the way, from the team is that who's looked at the detailed submissions at a much greater level of detail, was that in this category, a lot of the submissions were mostly from local school districts, schools or organization. The Department of Education only had one request, and that was in the cybersecurity area, and there weren't many on the higher ed side.
On the this is Representative Williams again on the K-12, with the schools, public schools receiving 1.3 billion in ESSER funding. I would think that just from one perspective that they would be lower priority.
Yeah, very well, maybe. You know, that was the thought about as well, kind of overlaying the, you know, what the funding to date, how it lines up against all of these areas, right? So good point.
And the other point I would make is that many of the agencies, departments that are funded through our state, they have access to funds. And I would think that another potential priority of ranking would be who doesn't have sufficient access to support. Whereas even our school districts are receiving Bay State aid increases, they're getting general fund increases that are increasing consecutively over a 5-year period with an inflator thereafter. So, and that's just one branch, but then, or one agency, but there are many that the state takes care of, like a KDHE and so forth.
Yeah, and yeah, point taken. And that was actually a little bit, I think we talked about in the first session of, you know, a lot of the focus in the initial fact pack was more around behavioral health and childhood services, partially because just the depth of the need and maybe the lack of a lot of focused funding in some of those areas. But, you know, in some other areas were brought up as well that where those issues probably exist too. But that was a little bit of the thought process that went into it. There also is a page in the appendix. It's in this appendix. If it is, let's flip to it, take a look at it. Yeah, this was the page from the previous time around, you know, when the Spark Executive Committee had kind of honed in more on behavioral health and early childhood development. Those are some of the factors that it was probably looking at. That was before my time, but to your point, Representative Williams, a way of thinking about it. All right, before we move on from this, any other thoughts, or should we move on to the next one?
Let's go to the next one.
Go ahead. Move on. Disability and senior services, let's go to 1110. Read through this, and then we can have a discussion around it. Once again, a lot on the capacity side here. So open it up to discussion, same game plan, reactions, observations.
This is Sean. I obviously there's a lot fewer submissions in the other slides or other areas you already went over. I'm a little bit surprised on that, although I did have someone tell me within one of these sectors that it's not time to do a renovation or add on to the house when the house is on fire. So maybe that's the reason. And both of these areas have been disproportionately impacted by COVID. So I think that does play into this. And as I skimmed the requests from what was sent last night, there were some large proposals around where there's 5 around recruit and retain incentives. So again, I ask that we look at that as a cross-cutting theme between the areas.
Yep.
And there were several proposals. I think they're good ones around the facility or program expansion that would be one-time funds that would not have trailing impact, which I think is important as well, to use existing funds or other resources where one-time funds are helpful to build capacity to be able to keep people at home longer, whether that's supportive housing or renovations or additions or whatever that may be.
Yeah, and the other way to look at it, I mean, certainly understanding how many submissions came in the various areas is good. It's a good piece of information to have. But you know, I think if we look across just all the submissions across all the panels, there are definitely kind of some sectors that kind of maybe even coordinated a little bit more in getting the word out in terms of putting in submissions. And so sometimes just looking at the submissions themselves can be a little bit misleading. So. And the other thing is there may be some real overlap here with some of the other focus areas like behavioral health. And once again, this is an area where KLRD pulled together a lot of kind of the existing work that had been done and information. So there are more fact packs around this to the extent that you know, everyone's not aware of the full kind of lay of the land here. Once again, we hadn't focused on this as much or at all really in the pre-reads that we'd originally given you. So we tried to kind of true up the information set a little bit in the information we just sent you. Any other thoughts here? let me catch up. So why don't you go to the next slide? And I think we've been touching upon this, is that, one of the big challenges here is going to be just how to focus. And, we've had a lot of good discussions, I think, about, applying some other overlays to these in order to understand how, each one of these areas, not only do we have the pre-read data around the depth of the need or the, by focus area, also just the number and the nature of the submissions, highlighting the opportunities and needs, as well as some of those other overlays around, goals around equity, overlay of, other funding sources. So, coming up with a way of being able to prioritize is going to be pretty important. And then secondly, particularly in the areas that, prioritize, really being able to understand, what's the right way to go about thinking about the solutions there, even beyond the submissions, looking at best practices, per Robyn's point. And then also thinking about, are there some of these cross-cutting, some of these needs where, there's a potential for some cross-cutting solutions, where, maybe same root causes, same issues, where may be able to do something that will raise a lot of boats. So any thoughts about this? I mean, I think this is a little bit of a summary of where we came out in terms of our discussion anyway.
John, this is Robyn again. I was thinking very similarly to a comment you just made about needs that are cutting across all these areas. And I think I've made comments about this to my team over the last year or so. The STEM recruiting, so whatever that is, science, technology, engineering, and math, they have done that group of industries that recruit people into those fields has historically done such a great job, starting with kids in elementary school, to recruit them and get them on the path to one of those fields. And health and education have not done, at least anything that's been visible to me, nearly as good a job of making it a huge initiative. And every one of these submissions or these categories includes, we need to recruit and we need a pipeline. So that might be bigger than any one of the submissions, but maybe wrapping that need from these areas together to figure out, how do we do something like STEM collectively?
Yeah, that, and it depends upon what part of the pipeline you want to focus on, right? It's, are you getting people to train for the field? And then once they train, how do you get them, maybe if it's an issue, how to stay in Kansas, right? And then you could get into things around, golden handcuffs, in terms of their student loans to stay in Kansas for 5 to 10 years. Once again, I'm not an expert in any of this. Someone had kind of mentioned to me a couple of days ago, but there may be lots of potential levers to pull, and some of those levers could actually apply across almost all of these focus areas. So you can go to the next slide, and everyone's going to like the next slide, because the other common theme was, hey, give us a little bit of a break in the middle of these sessions. So I suggest we take to about 11:21 or 11:22, give people a chance to kind of catch up on their emails and texts, and then we'll come back and then we'll talk more about how we're going to approach the filtering and prioritization, get some early thinking on that, and then talk about next steps. So why don't people take, we have a good amount to take to like 11:23, and then we can regroup. Okay, we're in the 1 minute drill. We'll try and get together in again in about a minute. Okay, people are ready to get started? Okay. Going to move on to the next section to talk about filtering or prioritization. One thing that I'm going to kind of make a call on here is we thought potentially we could revisit, this collaboration board, similar to what we did last time. I'm going to skip over that, suggest we skip over that right now, and we can revisit that at the end if we want to. But given just how much late breaking information there's been that people are just now starting to absorb, I think we want to kind of go into some other things, maybe a little bit higher priority. So on slide 25 in front of you is the highest level view about where we are. I talked about this before, and kind of we're at the point where we need to start thinking about not only how to prioritize, but even also how to filter. So to the extent there are some submissions or some areas where we would say early on, those are things that are either going to just get outright filtered out because of allowability constraints, so you just couldn't do anything there. Or areas that we may want to begin thinking about, the very least, that we might have less emphasis in terms of weighting. Let's have at least an initial discussion around that. As I mentioned, we have consultants that are looking at each submission and have already started applying some of their expertise around whether things are always allowable, never allowable, and it depends. And we're going to continue to be doing that. And as we group things into programs, for every single program, we're going to be looking at in detail. And often, understanding what could make it allowable, per Mclean's point around, if it's targeted against impacted populations, certainly that is within the sweet spot of these funds. So I'll go to the next slide where we can begin to have a little bit of a discussion. So as I just mentioned, in terms of kind of required, it's, is it allowable? Because if it's no, or couldn't be shaped to be allowable, then, no sense in us going forward with it. But there are a lot of other things to consider around potential filtering criteria. In some cases, they could be just a hard filtering criteria. In some cases, they could just be things that we kind of take into account as we move forward. So alternative funding, can we fund it with non-SFRF dollars? Is there an existing program that's similar or one that's envisioned? Investment type, is this a one-time or an ongoing investment? Once again, that's a really important area in the guiding principles from the Spark Executive Committee. And then even funding scale, I don't know if it's necessarily, this is probably a little more of, is this a broader idea that could have a breadth of impact, right? As opposed to something that may just be very, very narrowly focused. So anyway, kind of curious people's thoughts around, from their perspective, how we should think about these filters from their standpoint, given the discussion we've had, probably beyond the allowability one. Any thoughts?
John, it's Renee. I'm sorry. Could you please repeat that? Robyn was indicating to me that she was having trouble connecting, and so I think both of us were maybe a little
Okay, good.
offline for just a
Sure.
moment. So could you please repeat that last part?
Okay. I'm gonna get in the exit survey again that we want John to talk less. So, you know, as we think about filtering, you know, there are a number of these submissions that, you know, so many of them that, you know, if we have an opportunity to filter some out, we probably should, because that will allow us to be able to place more focus, you know, things like best practices, creative solutions against the things that we think are going to be the highest impact, at least coming out of the gates. We'll score everything eventually. But if something is like a non-star around allowability, like you just cannot do it, you know, with this set of funds, then, you know, we will filter that out, and we already have experts in the consultant support team looking at that. And you'll probably see, if you look through the submissions, they've been able to say on several, is it allowable? Yes or no, hard no, or is it depends, right? Then there are a bunch of other filters that could be potential filters. And we can, and the panel can decide, you know, do you want to make it a hard filter or just something that weights a lot, you know, when you're doing the scoring. So I think it was Representative Williams that said, hey, you know, let's understand where alternative funding exists, you know, where, you know, maybe it doesn't make sense to use SFRF dollars there. So the question is, you know, how much to weight that in and think about it in terms of filtering. Is there an existing program that would be similar? You know, the fourth one is really the investment type. Is this a one-time or an ongoing investment? Because that's going to be an area that, with the guiding principles from the Spark Executive Committee, is going to be a really important thing that they're going to be looking at in terms of things that are presented to them across the panels. And then the last one is funding scale. And I might actually even think about that a little bit differently. It's more like the breadth of the impact of the idea. It's, you know, which things are maybe more point solutions versus things that could have broader impact, could be a way to think about that. So anyway, so with that, Senator Erickson, I open it up to say, you know, given everything we've talked about, you know, how do people think about this beyond just the what's definitely or definitely not allowable for SFRF?
This is Senator Sykes, and I think, you know, as we're looking at them, making sure it is, you know, one-time investment, or we do have the potential to continue the program, because I think it would only be devastating if we put something in place and it's very helpful, and then, you know, a year or 2 years out, we're having to pull it back and we're doing more harm than good. So I think that should be, you know, one of those high stakes of, you know, is this a one-time investment, or are we really just creating a cliff for ourselves in the future?
Mm-hmm.
This is Robyn. I fully agree with that.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts? Yep. Mclean agrees as well. And in terms of the, you know, alternate funding or other sources of funding, you know, we can certainly do that overlay per Representative Williams' suggestion. And it may not be a hard filter, but it certainly could be something that will impact the scoring, would be my guess, with the panel. Anything else? Yeah, we can also, the other point is we could do an overlay on state and local area of impact based on the earlier request. So not only, you know, per Mclean's suggestion about, like, let's see where this lines up against some of the other work that's been done around equity, we can also look at, you know, what portions of the state are, you know, the potential, you know, initiatives or programs impacting. So we can understand in terms of geographic equity as well.
This is Sean. On the overlay, I don't know, this isn't necessarily a filter or a scoring, but there's also been a lot of work done in the mental health modernization committee, series of committees over the last couple of years. So maybe comparing their recommendations that'd be appropriate for one-time funds that meet this filter or criteria to compare or overlay to whether proposals submitted, and then filtering that through the system. And the same thing for senior care task force type thing as well.
Good point. Yep. Okay. Move to the next slide. So next step, we're going to finalize the filtered list of programmatic areas. So part of that is going to be involved. So just to kind of level set everyone, of the 251 proposals, we're not going to lose them, but we are going to start grouping them into programmatic themes to begin thinking about them as well. Some of them may be very standalone, in which case we'll think about them, make sure we get to the standalone details well. We're not going to lose the proposals. And then also be applying kind of the filtering lens to them, so that ones that just cannot fit with this set of funds, just in terms of the allowability guidelines, we'll note that. And they won't make it through to the next level of consideration, because they're going to be ample points of consideration as we go. And then we also want to begin to kind of help move the process forward, in partnership with the panelists, actually conduct some more detailed review around those programmatic areas, and set ourselves up for beginning to think about even the discussion around scoring some of these things so we can set priorities. So go to the next slide. So between now and the next session, which looks like it's probably going to land at the start of March, the one thing we'd like everyone to be able to get a chance to kind of play around in the submissions a little bit more and look at them, look at some of the additional fact packs that we had sent out, submit any specific research requests to us in any of the areas, and particularly if there are areas where you think, bringing forward best practices, or even who might be the people to tap on there. Would be great, and potentially even bringing experts in. And we're going to be working to build out those program templates. And as we build them out, interact with the panelists on those program templates to begin kind of getting your thoughts around them. And it'll probably be a little bit easier to envision when we get to what those templates look like, and help you understand what we're asking for. So go to the next slide. So in terms of each area, programmatic area, once again, this is a little bit what we're trying to aim for in terms of being able to have a description around the program, the goals, eventually getting to what the target asks and minimum viable ask would be if you're going to move forward on it. Begin in that around under additional impact and feasibility details, begin doing some of that profiling around understanding how to think about these from an equity standpoint, or feasibility standpoint, if other funding sources are available, financial sustainability, is this something that could create a cliff? And are we really pushing to understand, even something that looks like a one-time investment, is it potentially going to create some trailing costs requirements? And then some additional considerations. So making sure we don't lose sight of the submissions and the projects that fell into those categories, the allowability considerations, and understanding some of those interdependencies between each particular kind of program idea versus some of the other areas, because there will be some linkages. And at the same time, as we're working as a support group to kind of begin building these, you'll in the follow-up, the exit survey, we're going to want to get from the panelists, okay, which areas are of most interest to them, kind of raise their hands around areas where they would like to be able to kind of roll up their sleeves and get involved with it. Once again, the heavy lifting for the start of it, to react to is going to be done by the support team, because everyone here is day jobs. But it's really going to be with the panelists around getting them thinking about each one of these areas around those key discussion questions at the bottom left. So go to the next slide, because that just kind of lays it out. So as usual, we've tried to kind of templatize everything, just because there's so much here. We want to make sure we're efficient around kind of capturing information and leveraging your time. So in each one of the areas, what are the pros and cons of that program area, that set of ideas? How do we ensure the program meets the guiding principles? Does it? And how do we ensure that if it doesn't, that it does? And what are some of the other questions that we may want to dive deep on, just so that we make sure that as the support team is kind of pulling this stuff together, we're like fully engaged with the panel members between this meeting and the next one. Any questions around that? I'd open up, but the one thing to note too is that, and I think I mentioned this during the kickoff, is that this is kind of a novel approach for thinking about strategy and prioritization at the state level. And so we kind of have done as good a job as we could in terms of planning it out ahead of time and what each step would be, just for efficiency's sake, and to make sure we're bringing the right information to the panel and the Spark Executive Committee to be able to make important decisions. But since this is kind of the first time doing something exactly like this, the only thing that we knew for sure was that as much thought as we put into the process, it was going to be wrong in some ways. We got into it and we need to adjust. And so, the way I want the panel to think about it is that, we have basically created the process for the panel, and we'll continue to, modify it or adjust it as we need to with the panel. And we got a lot of suggestions today. They're going to be really helpful around thinking about each one of these opportunities. And so really appreciate that. We realize that these are going to be important decisions for the panel to be able to make. Anything that we can do along the way to help the panelists, as well as, any suggestions you have for, ways where we may need to course correct, please let us know. So let me just stop for a moment there and kind of get any thoughts or comments from folks before we move forward. All right, we'll go to the next slide. I think it's good we didn't do the collaboration exercise, because I think that we've gone through a lot. We gave you guys a lot of information. There's still a lot to absorb. I really feel good about the discussions that we had today. I know it's a lot for people to wrap their heads around. It's a really broad topic area. And additionally, there is opportunity in probably every single one of those cells, so figuring out how to prioritize what to focus on, and also being able to think about how we bring best practices and really impactful, solutions to the most important areas is going to be a really big task, exciting one. So I talked about what we're going to be doing between this meeting and the next meeting. Once again, really please fill out the exit surveys to help us understand, how and where you would like to engage. In the next session, we are going to start having those templates completed, and going to begin working through some of those, as well as bringing in experts and beginning to align on exactly how the panel is going to prioritize and score things. Given the wealth of things that can be focused on. So with that, that's really all we're going to go through. Any summary thoughts or observations or closing comments from anyone?
John, it's Senator Erickson. I would just say thank you to the committee members who were able to join today, and for the great feedback and discussion, and to your team for all of the work getting this turned around so quickly. And I just encourage everyone to please provide feedback via the exit survey.
Thank you.
I agree, John, you and your team, that was a great summary that you sent out last night. It was obvious a lot of work has already been done so that this becomes somehow absorbable by all of the committee members. And I know it will take time, but I would just encourage my fellow committee members to really put the work in to understand these proposals and take a look at them so that we can get through this next couple of meetings work to decide which ones we send forward.
Great. Well, thank you once again. We have the team site. Hopefully it's going to get easier and easier to access over time. But on that team site is, all the contact information, so you know how to reach us, or anyone has a request or a question, reach out to me as well. Thank you.